now. His PhD is on the transformation of urban places from late antiquity to early Middle Ages. And he published his book, in fact, later on, Cities in Transition in 2009. Since his PhD, he has been working on Cyprus, on islands of Eastern Mediterranean, and he has published on these topics as well. In 2017, his book came out, Cyprus Between Late Antiquity and Early Middle Ages. And the new book is forthcoming, the Early Byzantine Insular World. Today he's going to present us actually his work on his latest research, Byzantine Islands in the Middle Ages. So I leave the floor to you then.
Well,
here's the board marker if you need it.
Yes, thank you. Well, I have to thank the Department of History as Mayıs University, where I have friends, Muslim, Muslim Hoca, Emrah Hoca. So upon thanking them, and upon thanking in particular Dr. Özlem Çekent for a kind invitation, well, it's an invitation which allows me to pursue, bir dakika, ben Türkçe biraz konuşuyorum. Çok üzgünüm, İngilizce konuşuyorum. Tamam, çok üzgünüm. So, upon thanking Dr. Çekent for her invitation, I have to say that I'm particularly happy because that allows me to pursue or to present part of my research on Byzantine islands, which is an interest that for a while I shared with Dr. Çekent herself, who I was lucky to have as a department chair in my previous job in Cyprus, and here is the proof that people should have fired me back then. So I was in Cyprus, and therefore I got interested into the history of this wonderful island, and I was also lucky because that's how I moved basically to the Byzantine Islands, which is my area of expertise, coming from or starting this journey from Cyprus. And in Cyprus, indeed, I was lucky enough, or we were lucky enough to have our offices, Özlem, Dr. Çekent and I, in between two cities. One was Salamis Constantia, the capital of the island of Cyprus in the period I'm going to talk about, 6th to 9th century, and the medieval city of Famagusta, which is, I'm sure, famous or known to most of you because it was the place where the famous siege 1571 happened, Lala Mustafa Pasha and Bragadino. So I'm sure Famagusta is known to you, a place, Famagusta, of boasting a unique cultural heritage which speaks of cross-cultural encounters, and where indeed, and I quote, the tongues of many nations could be heard in its streets and square. So, speaking of encounters, I want to start this paper to quote here a strange insular encounter that a Saint Constantine the Jew in the 10th century happened to have in Cyprus. He was a pilgrim coming from Antalya. He traveled to Cyprus, and as more often than not pilgrims do, he stole, or he wanted to have a souvenir. And in this case, for us, a souvenir may be many things. Magnet to put on the fridge. For him was the finger of a saint, which he stole. But among the other things, while he was and after he stole the finger, he went to pray, in a sense, to atone for his sin, to pray in a church, and to his dismay, he found out that also Saracens, Muslims, actually used the same place to pray. So it's an episode, in a sense, that reminds us of other instances in which you had building used at the same time by Muslims and Christians, the Mosque of Damascus, for instance, or the Cathedral of St. Vincent in Cordoba later on. But in light of these encounters, of these cross-cultural encounters, therefore, I found a sense and inspiration to probe the insular world, because it occurred to me that islands could be indeed unusual places. I don't want to bore you to death now here with a long list of scholars who have worked on the Mediterranean, from Brodel, Orden, Purcell, Abulafia, Reinberg, but all these scholars stress this ambivalence of islands, this uniqueness of islands as because they dwell upon the idea of remoteness and periphericity, conservative and isolated spaces, vis-à-vis their importance as nodes, unescapable, I would say, nodes of interaction and hubs of connectivity. I will return in a few moments to this dichotomy, to this two aspects of insularity, and because now I would like to spend some words, or few words, on the choice I have made here today in terms of selection of islands and time period which I'm going to scrutinize. It will soon become clear that the key studies here have more to do with the role played by the largest islands in the Mediterranean as constituting a politically coherent and economically vital system within the Byzantine Empire. Although Sicily, Cyprus, as well as Sardinia, Crete, and Malta, and the Balearics all nominally remained under Byzantine domination, sometimes loose, sometimes more stricter, we can document local society and individuals developing peculiar identities, attitudes to accommodate foreign trends, abilities, and to navigate through the interstices of supposed monolithic cultures and developing capabilities for adjusting to the ebbs and flows of Mediterranean politics. And this is the first point. The second point has to do with the time span I chose here, which is a crucial one, is in the history of the Mediterranean, the one period immortalized, made famous by Henri Pirenne in Mohammed and Charlemagne, his book Mohammed and Charlemagne. But the supposed downturn that Pirenne advocated for, in my opinion, had less to do with the Arab invasions than with the breakdown of Mediterranean unity, which veered away from the unified entity which still was there under Justinian up until the 6th century. So what Pirenne described as an impermeable frontier, as no man's land up to a point, the Mediterranean turned into a kind of barren sea, I propose a picture of complex and multifaceted interaction, and in a sea which could be at the same time a permanent battlefield and a zone of intense commercial and maritime activity on the part of its bordering states. So in other words, this period, the early medieval period in a sense, reveals itself from the 6th to the 9th century, more or less, reveals itself as one in which new modes of interaction were forged in a shared maritime space. As Picard has famously stated, it is from the island you can control the sea, as a matter of fact. So in light of these two above mentioned points, referring to the time span and to my selection of islands, I want to bring to your attention the problem that I would like to discuss here today with you, which has to do with the peculiar social, economic, cultural, and political strategies adopted by the islands I mentioned before, during and before the so-called Dark Ages, or over the medieval period, the early Middle Ages. So in order to answer to this question, I will address the following issues. The first has to do with islands in Byzantine historiography, and how we as Byzantinists regard islands, and why islands are in a sense important anyway, something that I've already referred to. Second, city of islands, urbanism in some of the places, or some of the insular context I was talking about, and those are Crete, Sardinia, Cyprus, and Sicily. And finally, I will try to conjure up, in a sense, the Byzantine insular system in terms of economic resilience and political expediency. So, I will start here from a real historiographical imbalance, because we Byzantinists don't like islands. That's a matter of fact. We really don't like it. We really don't, we are not really fond of them. We don't devote a great deal of attention to them, and when we do, we tone down the role that they played, turning them in a sort of peripheral addition to the real stuff, to the Byzantine heartland, defined by Chris Wickham as the pairing of two geopolitical contexts, the Anatolian plateau and the Aegean. This is what really mattered in a sense, and the capital being in the center, Constantinople. The rest was just periphery. So this kind of historiographical contempt with islands seems to draw from what Cosentino described as the two opposite attitudes, the Greeks and later the Romans, obviously, and finally the Byzantine, and obviously their culture, had towards islands. So on the one hand, island, as I mentioned before, evoke an idea of remoteness, marginality, an attitude that seems to permeate even the Ottoman world, because as recently pointed out by Professor Gurkan, the islands in the Ottoman period showed a dual nature as closed and isolated worlds, and I'm quoting here, paradoxically situated at the center of maritime trade connection and seaborne distribution, which rendered them ideal places for intelligence activity in the Ottoman Mediterranean. But on the other hand, the function in terms of commerce and connectivity cannot be ignored. In other words, it seems that one can seldom escape from a trap made of two opposites, static, dynamic, the dichotomy I was talking about before, isolation, connectivity, conservatives, openness, which de facto encompasses and concludes any attempt to propose a definition of an island. And Byzantine literary sources played with this idea, because one of the few sources referring to islands or talking about island has to do with this conspiracy that one of the nephews, the illegitimate son and the nephew, some members of the family of Emperor Heraclius in the early 17th century, staged against Heraclius himself, and once Heraclius found out about the conspiracy, sent his nephew to Gozo, to Malta, okay, with instruction to the local governor to cut, literally, one of his legs upon arrival. So the idea is that islands were places of exile for political prisoners, for conspirators, but also for intellectuals and bishops, so those who don't or did not align to the current orthodoxy, political or religious one, doesn't matter, those could be therefore confined to islands. Obviously islands were not the only place where this could happen, where people could be exiled. There were many others, the Crimean Peninsula for instance, but in the Byzantine sources this idea, whenever islands are mentioned, they are often because people were exiled or sent there away from the center, from the capital. Here could be someone could be tempted into seeing in all these episodes, in this idea, a clear example of the place islands had in the Byzantine imaginary, marginal and liminal spaces, even on the verge of being uncivilized in a sense. Apart from the fact that islands were not, as I said, the only region of the empire where this could happen, where people could be exiled, by using archaeology and material culture, it is possible, in my opinion, to propose, to move away, in other words, to scratch the surface and see through tropes, literary tropes and speculations which the Byzantine chronicles and the geographer used, and which are, to be honest, too often accepted or paid a lip service to by Byzantine historians. I will return to this in a few moments, of course, but I would like to briefly mention here that archaeology, for instance, has shed new light on the medieval life of Malta, recent excavation, reassessment of old archaeological survey, numismatic coins, sigillographic evidence are all demonstrated that from the mid-7th century on the Maltese archipelago, the Maltese islands, were not simply a distant outpost on the imperial frontier, but the islands showed, and I quote, a degree of autonomous action in communal terms, managing to economically bridge and the the political divide existing between the Byzantines and the Arabs, end of quote. And there is no better example of this. This is then ceramics, but in particular a seal which belonged to a Nikitas, Archon Kedrugarius of Malta, meaning basically an official of the Byzantine Navy, which was not found in Malta, but was found in Tunisia, oddly enough. So there was this bridging the gap, even on the part of official Byzantine authorities that had a correspondence, a seal meme, a correspondence going on, or a kind of interaction, political interaction going on between the insular authorities, the Maltese Byzantine authorities, and the Arab North Africa. So this prominence of archaeology and material evidence in try to propose a kind of different analytical approach to the fate and historical development of large Byzantine island in the period I'm talking about should be regarded as a methodological complement to 4 crucial points that I want to present here today. The first, the selection of islands I'm using right now. The focus of my attention will go to the biggest ones. I'm leaving some of them aside. Corsica, conquered by the Lombards and later the Carolingians at the beginning of the 8th century, therefore remains outside the scope of my research. I am also deliberately leaving aside the Aegean part of the Earthland, because of the reason I mentioned before, because it was not exactly regarded as part of the insular system, or possibly part of the insular system I try to devise here. And whereas Sicily, I'm going to use Sicily in a comparative perspective, because Sicily is a little bit of an exception, because as always, in the last 10 years, it benefited from better published archaeology, and in a sense has always been more familiar to Byzantinists, because it was elevated to the rank of theme in the around 700, and it was always an important source of grain of Constantinople after Syria, Palestine and Egypt fell, and it was also made immortal by the famous journey of the Emperor Constantine II, who died in a bathtub in Syracuse. He was assassinated while taking a bath in Syracuse, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine II. The second point, which stems from the previous one, has to do with the historical perception of islands as lying at the margins of the political, military and strategic interest of Byzantium, in the time when the Mediterranean became a more economically fragmented, politically conflictual and religious divided and culturally disputed place. In fact, and this represents the third and most important point, I already talked about the historiographical imbalance, I would like to stress here that archaeology of major urban sites on Byzantine islands prompt us to sketch a clearer and comparative picture of the process of socio-economic transformation experienced by the Mediterranean during the fragmentation and localization of a former unified exchange system. And then quoting here, throughout the 7th and 8th century, Ireland seems to remain an economic space relatively more developed than northern and central Italy, the Balkans and Asia Minor. And numismatic sigillography, ceramic evidence, will be conjured up here to prove that these insular spaces, the insular spaces I mentioned, remain indeed more resilient, economically speaking, than other regions of the Byzantine Earthland. I hope to show that Constantinople nevertheless remained vigilant and interested in their affairs, as shown by the persistence of structure of fiscal, military and religious governance, whereas the local aristocracy and ecclesiastical elites revolved around Byzantium in terms of economic interest, political solidarities and socio-cultural identities. This latter assertion allows me to talk about the fourth and final point to be addressed throughout the paper. This has to do with the peculiarity of the insular administrative and fiscal structures, as well as the socio-cultural and political flexibility, expediency, I was mentioning before, showed by the fiscal representative of the central government, as well as the civic, military and religious authorities. A ruling class, sorry, this is talking about Sicily and archaeology, a ruling class, the so-called potentiores, characterized essentially by the ownership at different and various levels of locally entrenched social and economic power. has already hinted at Monday ranks one can find the actors of a cross-cultural dialogue which actively transcended the so-called Islamic Byzantine frontier. Here, the geostrategic vocation of islands to act as a bridge connecting two or more political, cultural, religious and ethnic actors chimes with the peculiar medieval concept of frontiers, defined as dynamic processes embodying cultural interaction, often promoted by merchants and artisans, as well as diplomats, pilgrims, and even mercenaries, soldiers. So, as I extensively mentioned by now, scholarly interest on large Byzantine islands has been a little bit crippled or a little bit missing, and indeed the only real overview of Byzantine islands is this book written in French, which makes things even worse, that appeared in 1988 and has remained the unavoidable starting point for anyone studying this subject, this topic. True, there are other studies which deal with single insular entities, with single islands, but nothing of this sort has appeared, and 40 years, if I'm not mistaken, 30 years, pardon, have already passed. What Malamud is also talking about only two islands, Cyprus and Crete in particular. She neglected the western islands, and she basically proposed an idea of Cyprus and Crete, of these two eastern Mediterranean islands, as outposts along a frontier with the Muslim world. An idea which I found myself resistant to, an idea which, in a nutshell, advocates for the islands being a continuation of the very famous eastern frontier between the Arabs and the Byzantines, between the Umayyads and the Byzantines, between the Abbasid later and the Byzantines. But at the same time, I advocate for a reassessment of the concept of periphericity of the Byzantine insular world. I would rather, in other words, suggest that Sicily and Cyprus, and to a lesser extent Crete, Malta, Sardinia, and the Balearics, acted as a third economic and political pole between the Anatolian Plateau and the Aegean Sea in the Byzantine Mediterranean. This upon shedding archaeological light, using archaeology a lot, material culture and archaeology, to in a sense, propose a different geopolitical stance or connotation of the Byzantine Empire. In truth, this, and this is a passage from Malamud, which basically gives you an idea of what historiography, Byzantine historiography, thinks of islands, a catastrophe in a sense. As I was saying, a reassessment or a volume which contributed to sharpen the focus a little bit, to move away, to veer away, has appeared in 2013, an edited volume which started, as I said, this debate, this new debate on Byzantine Island, as published by Zanini, Michaelides and Pergola, and which approach I will ideally pair here with the idea of islands as gateway communities that promoted social encounters and cultural interchange. And this is the insular system I'm talking about. So in a sense, in a very broad perspective, the idea that the islands rather became, I mean, from this picture you can see that the islands became a sort of third pole, okay, between the other two. One has to be extremely careful, because as you can see in Cyprus, which is blurred a bit, some of those islands, this idea of the system that Zanini, Pergola and Michaelides proposed must be, in a sense, revised. And I give you an anticipation of what I'm going to tell you in a few moments. In particular, the two extremes of this system, Cyprus and the Balearics, had a peculiar connotation in political, cultural and economic terms. The Crete and Sardinia had a different kind, or slightly similar, and different from the other two, but other similar ways. Sicily was a little bit of the exception, confirming the norm because was elevated to the rank of team. So, sorry, yes. Having identified now the existence of, possible existence of an insular system, I would like to focus my attention, and I'm moving to the second part of my talk, to cities on islands. Obviously, I talk about Venice, but Venice gives you an idea of what a city on islands, and you are going to see that I'm playing with this word on islands could look like. Now, here we should admit that we are facing a rather uneven picture, because in some islands like Malta, the Balearics, and partially Crete, archaeology is completely in its infancy, as analysis of ceramics is missing, seals and coins are published piecemeal, but there is always light, or there is always, you have always to look at the glass half full, because, for instance, in Sicily, recent publication assessing coinage and other material indicators, like ceramics, have pointed to an island divided into the western and eastern half, as based upon amphora, for instance, and other types of glazed wares, lead glazed wares, with coins, both in gold and copper, maintaining itself with far better continuities than did that of Constantinople itself in the Aegean half of the Byzantine earthland. So in other words, you had a level of monetary economy almost unprecedented elsewhere in the empire. On the other hand, in Cyprus, the impact of new interdisciplinary analysis has allowed us to draw a rather less bleak picture than the one proposed by mainstream historiography, which basically used to look at the period under scrutiny as a sort of interlude, a sort of parenthesis between, or included between two golden ages. This one is dark. We don't care too much, and it's not really good. But archaeology has allowed to revise this period and put it in a better perspective. So, more important, focusing my attention on Cyprus and Sicily allows me to overhaul some preconceived historiographical models as used to interpret the political and economic changes occurring on these islands in the early Middle Ages. And I conjured up, I refer to cities, to urban settlement patterns, exactly to confirm this interpretative framework that I want to bring to your attention today. Exposed to the repeated Arab threat and of the left to their own devices by central Constantinopolitan authorities, and I quote here, insular aristocracy and local population had no choice but to abandon the previously prosperous late antique urban settlement and find shelter either in the hilly countryside or in fortification hastily built or refurbished, as occupying a small portion of the classic urban landscape. This is a mode, end of quote. This is a mode of urban development. Basically, people are running, I'm putting very bluntly for the students before they fall asleep, in particular, run to the hills, to quote a very old song that you won't remember, that doesn't matter, a metal song. So basically, the Arab invasion caused people to run to the hills, to leave the coast, and to occupy small fortified settlements, those who survived on the top of the hill. So it's kind of what I call the Malamutian model, a model which followed in the footsteps of Malamut, the author of the book I mentioned before. And this model has been proposed for many urban settlements across islands, Sicily, Cyprus, even in Sardinia. But we are in luck here, because when it comes to another island, Crete, one of the best and better excavated sites in Byzantine archaeology, in the history, and I would rather say of Byzantine archaeology, is Gorton, the capital of the city of Crete. And notwithstanding the fact that Gorton represented the main political, administrative, and ecclesiastical center of Crete, it seems to present remarkable similarities with other insular urban contexts, like, and we are going to see them, Salamis Constantia, Polis Arsinoe in Cyprus, Olbia in Sardinia, Agrigento and Syracuse in Sicily. In terms, and these similarities are in terms of maintenance of urban fabric, spaces and planning, and or socio-economic vitalities of their religious and secular elites, whose level of demand underpin the development of urban artisanal and commercial functions. In Gorton, we are confronted with a urban landscape which seemed to have maintained its coherence in terms of fabric and morphology well into the 8th century, although revealing the first traces of a changing type of urbanism, which according to some scholars should be defined or should be labeled as city of islands. Classic monumentality, so Ephesus style, okay, for those who have been to Ephesus, the first thing, the library of Celsus, or buildings like that. So classic monumentality coexisted with artisanal workshops and commercial activities, encroaching onto the public space and pointing to the considerable social and economic vitality of the local ecclesiastical and administrative elites. In Gorton, and here you can see this idea, I put islands of settlements on the map of the classical city of Gorton. Oops, yes. Excavation in an area of Gorton has indeed shed light on a rather densely built residential artisanal complex encroaching onto a former public space. This quarter is called Byzantine houses. A lot of fantasy there. And it is worth noticing that the similar to in this quarter you find this kind of structures. Two-story building. This is in Sicily, Syria, obviously not as well preserved as they used to be in Syria, or as you can find, for instance, in Jordan, but and you can also, I think, have another. Yes, but nevertheless, oops, you can still see this type of building, so traces of this, archaeological traces of this type of building in Gorton indeed. In Salamis Constantia, there are, obviously we have confronted in Cyprus with this problem. I don't want to bore you to death with this. No archaeological excavation is allowed, so we have to rely on previous archaeological documentation. But in Cyprus, it seems that the place, in particular this place in Salamis Constantia, the capital of Cyprus, the Byzantine capital of Cyprus, developed along the same lines we have seen for Crete, which echoed which we can actually see in Syria, Palestine. It is, however, important to tone down a bit a purely economic interpretation of these buildings in terms of continuous level of demand and production as underpinned, supported by resilient and urban-oriented elites. This is not to discount the fact that it is not useful to regard demonumentalization, narrowing of streets, and construction of private buildings onto public spaces as a sign of decay and decline, but rather as quintessential of a change of use and reconversion for a wide range of artisanal and commercial purposes. However, one should focus also on a social anthropological approach meant to highlight aspects of the history of urban context conceived as a place of archaeology of people and their everyday life. In this light, recent research has pointed out the importance of investigating structures meant to satisfy the two basic needs of people, bread and water. Tracing the latter, tracing water, helps us to better grasp the organization of urban spaces destined to daily life activity, whereas the former, bread, allows us to understand how those spaces were functioning. In Gorton, here we are, the archaeological evidence focusing on the problem of water supply seems to point to a double water system, rain and cistern fountains, that collected, stored and redistributed within single properties water as its availability was more localized and or privatized. This should mirror the above mentioned changing facets of the urban ruling class, with religious, administrative, and military function. A social group, the potentiores I showed you before, whose political power and status are elusive in terms of archaeological evidence. We cannot see them, truly see them in archaeological evidence directly, but whose faint traces are preserved in the flow of waters, of Gortinian waters. An analysis of the system of water adduction and distribution allows us to fully wade in the changing aspects of the osmotic relation between polis and chora, between the city center, Shehir Merkezi, and the countryside, the chora, in the period under scrutiny. We are facing, in other words, a middle class made of artisans and peasants who seem to have left the countryside to migrate in a city which retains its role as main actor of a socio-economic system based upon non-parasitic elites and monetary circulation. We find also money in Gorton. In this light, the city, Gorton, emerged as a hub connecting the microsystem of local artisanal and agricultural production with larger and increasingly fragmented Mediterranean macrosystem linked to distribution and production of goods on a wider, larger, regional, I would say, scale. And this relationship between the countryside and the city in Gorton, as proved, for instance, by water, came to an end, possibly from an earthquake, only because of an earthquake, pardon, in early 8th century, actually in the late first half of the 8th century. And here we can also mention the Cretan Archbishop Andreas, who, according to his life, written by his secretary, had a long successful career, which started here in Istanbul, in Constantinople, as a diacon of Hagia Sophia, and ended as Archbishop Metropolitan of Crete, an office which he held for 40 years, until his death for 30 years, pardon, until his death in 740. Andreas sponsored widely the construction of buildings, including a large complex with an hospital and a church dedicated, not by chance, to the Virgin Blachernitissa, like the one referring to the church and the shrine which was in Constantinople, which is most probably this church. You can see in the picture the church dedicated today to Aius Titus. It had completely a different name back then. And this mecenatism, the idea of sponsoring buildings on the part of the Archbishop Andrew, was clearly aimed to enhance the importance of Gorton as both the main religious center of the island, as showed by the refurbishment of different other buildings, including another church next to the main river passing through the city, and to highlight the importance of Gorton along Eastern Mediterranean pilgrimage routes. Andrew, mecenatism chimes with the increasing role played by the local clergy and the religious authority, the archbishopric here, in the insular administrative and bureaucratic machinery, as well as the political structure of governance, which occupied different areas within the former classic city of islands, as I was talking before. Bearing this in mind, we have also led seals belonging to imperial officers which were sent to Constantinople and found in Gorton, as well as other, by the way, Cretan city, all dated to the 8th century. They proved that the island was integral, was a part and parcel of the Byzantine administrative system and its military machinery. A similar interpretation of the change of urban social structures, political governance, and economic life as reflected upon urban fabric and planning can be proposed for other urban sites, insular urban sites. Another example, Salamis Constantia. I pair the two here, the capital, the ecclesiastical and political capital of the island of Cyprus in this period. Not to the contrary of what Malamud and others say, the city didn't shrink, in size during the passage from late antiquity to the early Middle Ages. The construction of a new, well-built fortified enclosure, possibly in the second half of the 7th century, which deliberately cut one of the main axes of circulation, of urban circulation, reflects planning and availability of resources on the part of the local elites. So you may tell me, look, you show me a picture of a wall cutting a Roman street. Therefore, all the things you are saying don't make sense to me. But it depends on how this wall was planned. It was not built in a fortnight. Just put something up, like that happens in Ankara every now and then. You turn the street and you find a building that wasn't there the night before and you bump into it. But here it took time, it took planning, it took resources to build this wall, which fenced in a large portion of the city. So planning and availability of resources. People, the local authorities in Salamis Constantia, went all the way to build a gate, a monumental gate, which has also military function, so-called bent gate, okay, which you find in Ankara and in Maastricht. So there were imperial architects in charge of this. It was not simply someone local who woke up in the morning and said, well, let's build a wall and a gate, okay. In this area, so the gate at the intersection, actually, they built the gate at the intersection between the two main axes of the Roman city, the Cardo and the Decumanus. The walled area, as I said, occupied a large and elevated portion of the classic cityscape, and of course, I'm not discounting defensive needs here, but it also boasted important churches and religious buildings, including the main cathedral, the most important city, like the Basilica of St. Epiphanius, and others, which we're going to see in a second. Also, in the same, in a sense, on the same lines, along the same lines I was mentioning before, water, a huge cistern was built there, and inside the walled area, which reminds us of the water supply system documented for Gorton. And life, and this is the point I want to make here, continued also outside the walls. An example of this is the artisanal quarter I showed you before, the so-called Ulierie, which reminds us of other artisanal quarters, not by chance focused around churches found on another important city in Cyprus, which once again reminds us of the houses we have seen in Syria, Palestine. But more important than these artisanal and commercial quarters, huge pilgrimage centers remain vital and functioning outside the walls and literally next to the harbor. Harbor which we know was functioning until the 10th century. We have a Fatimid 11th century, and we have a Fatimid document, I mean, proving that. And not simply another pilgrimage site. A pilgrimage site which copied the most famous, was huge basilica here, double atrium, triple atrium actually, copying or trying to imitate, in a sense, one of the most famous religious building in the history of Christianity, the Basilica of the Anastasis, or the Resurrections, built around the Mezar of Christ, the tomb of Jesus. In the same way as here, they built something around, most probably, a piece of the Holy Cross, brought, according to the legend, by St. Helen herself in the 4th century. So this is huge complexes outside the city walls, okay, next to the harbor. And pilgrims, we know, visited this place, like Willibald in the 8th century. He stopped Cyprus, Paphos, on the way to Holy Land. So we know, we have other documentation, other sources telling us that those places where really people were coming all the way from England, and not because of Brexit, to get to Cyprus, and via Cyprus to the Holy Land. So members of the high clergy, pilgrims, local aristocrats, state officials, all contributed to maintain the economic resilience of the city, as showed by ceramic, sigillographic, and numismatic evidence. I'll spare you the misery of listing all this ceramic thing, because if I told you about red slipware, boom, people will fall like flies, for instance. But we have other kind of sources together with the material and archaeological one, telling, for instance, that Cypriots, possibly merchants, travel very often back and forth Syria in the 8th century. And who is telling us this? The Acts of the Seventh Ecumenical Council. So in the Seventh Ecumenical Council, since one of the participants was the Cypriot Archbishop, the Cypriot Archbishop said, yeah, I have people going back and forth to Syria. I'm so sorry about it. He was basically apologizing for that. We have evidence that 8th century Arab cargo owners frequented Cyprus because they left their graffiti on some amphorae. And we have traces of domestic quarters found in Paphos on the in the southwesternmost coast of the island. So there was even, most probably, an Arab quarter. Coins are a good complement with this, because in Cyprus you find circulating specimens, coins issued by the Constantinopolitan authorities, so Byzantine coins. You find so-called Arab Byzantine coins, which are coins issued by the Muslim authorities in Syria and Palestine, imitating, this is Muslim, imitating the Byzantine iconography. Okay. You find proper Islamic post-reform coins as well, and even Islamic fulus later on, which means that on the island people accepted different currency, different monetary units. So there is what a scholar called a transcultural and transregional acceptance of different coinage, different types of coinage. Byzantine, obviously, and Umayyad typology of coinage. Which, in a sense, play into the end of another source that we have, the Chronicle of Theophane Byzantines, that Byzantine source, which tells us that, that the people of Cyprus paid tribute to both the Muslims and the Byzantines, to both the Arabs and the Byzantines. So they paid taxes to both of them. Now, if we move to another kind of type of evidence, seals, okay, lead. Not this, lead seals. I always make this joke because this is too cute. I mean, I love it. Okay, if we move to seals, sigillographic evidence from Salamis Constantia speaks of a city and obviously of an island, which was part of the Byzantine administrative structure, fiscal machinery, and political hierarchical relation of power, because we have seals of people who boasted high court titles, but also middle-ranking officers and other types of state officials coming from local aristocratic families. Families which have sufficient level of literacy to have this kind of, to boast this kind of title. And we know that these families existed because in the 10th century, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenetos wrote a book called De Administrando Imperio, How to Administer the Empire, an handbook for his son, in which is mentioned, among the other things, that a Cypriot families called the Fangumenes were very good, so good that they could be sent to the Caliph, or were sent to the Caliph 2 centuries earlier, during the reign of Justinian II, to negotiate with him the release of some prisoners. It is possible, therefore, to conclude that in Salamis Constantia, as well in Gorton, local ecclesiastical and secular elites remain urban-oriented and presented us with a resilient, although flexible, degree of loyalty to Constantinople, the fact that they paid tributes to both, for instance, the Mayas and the Byzantines. The coherence of urban landscape and fabric, as well as urban economic life, benefited from the presence of wealthy classes, for urban life was not limited to the walled area, but overflew, in a sense, the fortified enceinte. Moving now away from the Eastern Mediterranean, moving to the Western Mediterranean, Sicily and Sardinia, well, we find a kind of similar story. Sicilian urban life could only here summon, conjure up, in a sense, in absentia, in absence, because we don't have too many sites which has been excavated, properly excavated, as we have seen in Salamis Constantia and in particular in Gorton. But we now there is enough evidence to conclude that Sicily remained a land of cities during the entire Byzantine period. People, once again, didn't run to the hill. One should remember that, indeed, as I mentioned before, it was from the Byzantine capital Syracuse that Constans II issued legislation concerning fiscal matters for the whole empire. Constans II, in the second half of the 7th century, relocated the entire court to Sicily. Everybody to Sicily from Constantinople. Although the city, and I talk about the capital where he was residing, Syracuse, shrank and tended to focus on a little island, his harbor was still frequented by pilgrims. Bilibald was one of them. And the city itself could boast example of a very vital vital building activities. And this is proved, for instance, by quite a unique case, a temple in the city center, which was in the period I'm talking about. Obviously the facade is later, is a Baroque facade, added later, but you can see from the side that what used to be a temple was turned into a church. And this is one of the few examples that we have. Another example is the Parthenon in Athens, for instance, very famous. So the Temple of Athena was converted into the cathedral, but we also know that the city was the seat of the Byzantine general, of the Byzantine head of the theme of Sicily. And we also know that in Syracuse we had coins being minted, coins which were literally found all over the place, once again from England down to Syria, Palestine. Those coins minted, issued in Sicily, in Syracuse in particular. Other Sicilian cities, even though located on the coast, survived, although experiencing obviously functional and structural changes in terms of urban landscape and socio-economic fabric. In Agrigento, located on the southern coast of the island, there is archaeological evidence of a requalification of urban life, not only confined to the Acropolis, but continuing in some parts of the former classic landscape. We know that they maintained a classic street grid. You know that Roman and Greek cities were built according to an orthogonal street grid. Miletus is an example of this, if you are interested. Here you retain, in the 8th and 9th century, still this grid. A residential quarter boasted new houses built in the period under scrutiny. A low intensity of occupation, in a sense, characterized the old city of Agrigento, with the harbor which remained frequented because it benefited from what has been called the trunk route, the route which linked the Tyrrhenian with the Aegean and Constantinople, made of fragmented routes. So you don't go straight from from Syracuse or from Sicily, from the Tyrrhenian to Constantinople. It's called cabotage. You take small journeys, like in order to save money, okay, taking the plane, we stop in Frankfurt and in Copenhagen and in London and finally in New York instead of taking a direct flight. People do that to save money because the ticket costs less. Note it down in case you are interested. Okay. In Syracuse, we have in Agrigento, we also have two pottery workshops, the necropolis in use well into the 8th century, another church, actually the cathedral, dedicated to St. Gregory, built in the 7th century, another church restored in the 9th century. So basically, we cannot say that the city was abandoned in the period under scrutiny. Other cities obviously fortified, Catania, Palermo, even Taormina, but not all of them suffer from, or should be, in a sense, interpreted, their development should not be interpreted along the same line. Last but not least, if we move to Sardinia, in a way that reminds us of Yenikapı excavation in Istanbul, the evidence that the islands did not simply turn into a military outpost along the frontier with the Muslim world, but rather remained a hub intersecting regional Rome, Naples, and medium and long distance commercial networks, up to Constantinople and Umayyad Spain, as I said, this idea is there. I mean, it can be seen or can be showed, because recent excavation, as I said, in a way that reminds of a Yeni Kapı, at the urban harbor of Olbia, proved or showed evidence of continuous commercial activities well into the 9th century. And once again, disproving the traditional narrative, which basically tells us that the city was abandoned already in the 5th century when the Vandals invaded the island. We don't have good archaeology, is true, but for a small number of Sardinian sites, but other places like Cagliari, the capital of the island, once again, tell us or prove that the fate of Sardinian cities cannot simply resolve in the opposition shrinkage, fortification versus Christianization and sanctuary. In other words, the traditional idea for Sardinian cities is that the city shrunk, and the best you could hope for was for a pilgrimage site to be built somewhere close by in order for the area to remain, I mean, a little bit occupied or frequented. There is a city, Aristianis, in Sardinia, which, oddly enough, was built from scratch in the 7th century and remained, and we know that because the most important church of this city was refurbished in the 9th century, remained frequented across this period. The most significant piece of evidence, though coming from Sardinia, is a bunch of lead seals, once again, which prove that, and dated between the 6th and the 8th century, which tell us that there was a correspondence going on between Constantinople and local authorities and Navy commanders. The seals, which basically tell us about this link between the court and the island, are also, or should be paired with an inscription which celebrates the great victory of a Sardinian consul, an inscription written in high tone, high pitch Greek. Very strange that someone went out of his way to write something in high pitch Greek. And this high pitch Greek is also found on inscriptions which embellish the lintels, the entrance of these 8th, 9th, up to 10th century churches which propped up, in a sense, in Sardinia. Once again, someone went out of his way to build these churches and to put inscriptions in Constantinopolitan Greek in order to show off, I want to look, or my legitimacy better comes from Constantinople. So we are talking about 8th, 9th, and 10th century. So this evidence should allow us to conclude that Sardinia retained a resilient political, military, and ideological bond with Constantinople. Oops, I'm running out of time. And this link did not exclude unorthodox political initiatives, because the Sardinians asked for help at some point even to the Carolingians. If they had to, they had no problem in going to that. So since I'm running out of time, I'm going really quickly here through the next 2 or 3 slides, I think. Balearics, very similar picture. Once again, seals belonging to or issued by Byzantine authorities, coins, both Muslims, this time Spanish Muslims, Spanish Umayyads, Emirate and then Caliphate, and Byzantine, but more important, this source, Arabic source, telling us that Balearics and Cyprus were the only Dar al-Had, the only 2 regions in the Mediterranean where there were 3 political communities: the Umayyads, Spanish ones in this case, the Byzantines, and the local people. The Balearics and Cyprus look like the 2 extremes of this insular system, which remain economic, vital, politically, in a sense, looking for Constantinople in terms of legitimacy, but which also were too close to 2 gravitational poles. For Cyprus, the Umayyad and later Abbasid Caliphate. For the Balearics, the Umayyad, yes, emirate and then caliphate to be ignored. And as in Cyprus we have the local people paying tributes to the Muslims and to the Byzantines, here in the Balearics we had basically the Muslim authorities telling us, look, Darahad, area of the Pact. And the people here, and this is the last point I want to make, the elites here, like in Sardinia, had no problem whatsoever in negotiating. If they were in trouble and the Byzantines could not help them, for instance, in the case of the Andalusian pirates plaguing the waters of Mallorca in the beginning of the 9th century, they asked for help from the Carolingians, in the same way as the Sardinian elites asked for help from the Carolingians. They had no problem whatsoever, very flexible political expediency. Constantinople loomed large, but it did not mean that these people should be pragmatic to death, in a sense, okay? And this is the two examples I'm basically talking about. To conclude, and I want to quickly get to the conclusions, two main themes have been enhanced in this brief, not really, paper. The first revolves around the economics of insular societies, and the second stressed the importance of islands as connective hubs with peculiar local, political, social, and cultural structures which remain within the Byzantine sphere of influence for longer than previously thought. They have been analyzed mainly through the looking glass, of the development of urban centers in some of the largest Byzantine islands of the Mediterranean during the transition, during the early Middle Ages, if you want, or the transition from late antiquity to the early Middle Ages. I beg for mercy here, because in the end I'm aware that this represents only the beginning in the sense of a journey, because as I said, Corsica has not been included, Malta has briefly been touched upon, the Balearics I had to, in a sense, touch briefly upon. But nevertheless I remain positive about having presented at least some of the elements that can help to define islands as economic and political resilient spaces rather than simply marginal frontiers, while at the same time proving that the darkness that supposedly engulfed the periphery of the empire in the aftermath of the Muslim invasions can be illuminated by the new light brought about material culture and archaeology. Here coinage, seal, ceramic allows us to tip the unbalanced dialogue between margins and metropolis, pointing to a relatively higher welfare of the insular world compared to the Anatolian plateau and the Aegean. A welfare that reflected both the uninterrupted, although diminished, role the islands played within the Mediterranean shipping routes, linking the eastern and western basin of the Mediterranean with the Aegean and Constantinople, pointing to the persistence of local levels of demand, urban-oriented elites, and regular, if not frequent, regional and sub-regional contacts. And eventually, I touch upon the peculiar political and administrative structure and strategies which the local elites could boast as molded by the difficulties, the peculiar difficulties of the hour. Sorry if it was too long. It was too long.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I have a few questions in mind, but for egalitarian reasons, let me ask just one. If we revise this narrative and say that the region of the insular system was actually quite active economically and politically, I guess, should there be a reflection of this in the cultural life? Do we have any traces of cultural high level or significantly high level of activity from this period, from this region?
When you say culture, what do you mean?
For example, I'd like to, I think we could see some outstanding people, maybe artists, maybe intellectuals coming from the islands.
We don't have the amount of evidence which allows us to tell us, but there are faint traces of interesting people, okay? And these interesting people can be, as I was trying to point out, most probably, actually, I didn't manage, could be local aristocrats, the Fangumenes 8th century sent to Damascus to negotiate. An archbishop of the 10th century, again from Cyprus, sent this time to Baghdad, again to talk. It seems that the Constantinopolitan authorities, when it comes to Cyprus, knew that the local elites, being they religious or secular, knew how to talk to the others. We had for the Balearics this very peculiar case of, we are already in the 10th century, where the Balearics were already in Umayyad hands. I'm talking about obviously Spanish Umayyad hands. They fell in 903, as you see there. But at some point, the Byzantine emperor of that time, and mid-10th century, sent a book from Constantinople to the Umayyad court in Spain, in Cordoba, in Greek. The problem was that there is a reason for that, because the Byzantines and the Umayyads for a while flirted with one another against the Fatimids. They didn't like the Fatimids, both of them. Then the Byzantines managed to negotiate a truce, a peace with the Fatimids, and this relation with the Umayyad Spanish was over. But nobody could read Greek, obviously, in Cordoba. There was nobody at hand, and they called on an Ibiza, a doctor from Ibiza, Balearics, who still could read Greek, which tells you, and we have sources from the Balearics in the 10th century also reminding that the Balearics were Byzantines for a while. So in order to answer to your question, no, we don't have exact, apart from these peculiar, the Drungarius from Malta is still found with the Muslim, in Tunisia. That guy, Niketas, is another example. But we don't have really people, because obviously the sources don't allow. And in the very case of Cyprus, if I can be extremely honest, after having published the book and having even more than enough, obviously Oslan played a part in that, having enough of Cyprus, I'm just joking. It looks like the Byzantine sources are not really comfortable, because the Byzantine sources are always produced from the center. They are written in Constantinople for Constantinopolitan audience. 99% of the time that's the case. It looks like the Byzantine sources are not happy to talk about places like Cyprus, places like Malta, places like the Balearics. Not because the Byzantines didn't keep an eye on them, because they did, obviously. Otherwise you won't have seals, or you won't have people try to look at Constantinople for legitimacy. But they didn't know how to define it. I think the Arab sources found a very nice for the Balearics and Cyprus, Dar al-Ad. But even when it comes to what to do with Dar al-Ad, the Arab authorities, the Qadi, they're discussing, they don't, especially when a truce is broken, because sometimes, as I told you, the insular people are very, I'm Venetian, so I'm half insular. We are really a bunch of bandits, okay? When we can, we break the rules. We sign the truce, and then we break it if we can 30 years later. So whenever the people from the Balearics of Cyprus break this treaty, huge debate in the caliphal court going on, because they couldn't define it. What should we do? We should punish them or not? But if we punish them, it means that we're going to punish the Byzantines, should be regarded as instigated by the Byzantines. And there is another example, very nice. I recently found out about this in a geography, and then I finish with this. In Antalya, it's not on an island, in Antalya, in the 9th century, Antalya was one of the main harbors of the Byzantine fleet, regional fleet, Attaleia back then. And at some point, the Abbasid, when in the 9th century, came and stormed the harbor because there was a truce going on, and the Byzantines broke that truce. And the local commander said, wait a sec, I personally didn't, they told me to do that. He literally says that if it was for me, we would always live in peace. There was no problem. They forced me to. I couldn't say no. And the Arab commander was, in a sense, very lenient. I said, okay, if you pay a sum, So there is this kind of strange things going on at the so-called periphery of the empire. You're not convinced? Okay, that's good.
Sorry, were you going to?
No, I said you're not convinced.
No, I was thinking about this question. Now, the way you describe it, though, I mean, it seems as if they are very receptive, right? I mean, they only sit there and wait until something arrives from Constantinople in terms of intellectual activity or cultural activity.
Yeah, this one, the Byzantine doctor.
But when you think of the archbishop's endeavor to build all these buildings and so on, it seems that they might have been producing something too. Maybe you don't have any access to these.
There is no way even to it's very, very difficult to with this kind of material to describe it. I mean, to try to find a stylistic or iconographic there is something going on, but for an earlier period. There you have the mosaics, for instance, which are in Cyprus. There they can understand because there were plenty, so there is also a lot of opportunity for comparative studies. But for the 7th and 8th century, basically the evidence we are working on is very scanty, so we don't know exactly if they, for instance, found out, in terms of material culture, it seems that there is a kind of Mediterranean koine going on. That, for instance, all of a sudden, across the Mediterranean, and in particular coming from islands or from coastal sites, you have this very short amphora being produced. The style may vary a bit. Obviously, the material varied because different places, different petrographic analysis, different minerals. But more or less, the idea is the same. Why? Because I'm provocative here. I'll go back to this point. I'm very provocative here. We always tend to look at the history of the Mediterranean broader. I'm longue durée, Brodelian here. Okay. Rome, everybody thinks of Rome. If I ask the guys here what is the most famous episode in the history of the Mediterranean, you can be 100%, oh, very close. Rome is the one, because Rome is Rome. The only instance on which the Mediterranean was unified under a single polity. Never happened before, never happened later. The Ottomans got close, but not that close. Okay, I think we tend to look at this Mediterranean, which there was a unification based mainly upon fiscal structure, because Rome needed to be fed and Constantinople needed to be fed, and therefore Egypt and North Africa sent huge amount of crops to Constantinople or to Rome, first Rome and then Constantinople. So we tend to look at the Mediterranean, sorry, the Eastern Mediterranean with Rome as the rule. Rome was the exception. The rule is, and now I'm going back to the global, in my opinion, humble opinion, the rule is what those amphora, little amphora, represent. Why they are so little instead of being big vases which could be put on Roman or Constantinopolitan state-sponsored ships going to Constantinople. Because that fragmentation of Mediterranean, which requires I'll stop, get off, get in with something else, is typical of the Mediterranean. It has always been like that, always been fragmented. And I think a colleague of ours, Matthew Arpster, also working in Cyprus, used to work in Cyprus, does now as a coach, prove it. That if you want to go from Syria to Spain, let's say, you don't go, there was no direct flight. Today there is a direct flight. Okay, there was no damn direct ship. You had to embark on a ship in, I don't know, Latakia. No, sorry. Not Tartus. Okay, on a Syrian harbor. Okay, Latakia is correct. Latakia. You have to stop in Antalya where someone got off, ships got off, then you move, take another ship, go into Rhodes, and so on and so forth. Willibald did like this. Jump on a ship in Sicily, to Reggio, from Reggio to Greece, to the Aegean, down, Ephesus, blah, blah, blah. It's hopping. It's not, and that's why the global amphora are really nice. It looks like we are going back to what was before Rome. Diversion. People want to go.